Hello and welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Sean Firmage. I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we start, I'd like to just remind you our next webinar will be Tuesday, July 18th. That will be with James Tanner at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, and it will be titled Making the Most of Fold 3. So it will be a brief presentation on that program, Fold 3. Also, before we start today, if there are any topics that you would be interested in hearing in the future, we'd love your input. There's a poll down at the bottom of your screen to enter any of those topics. Feel free to do that while we're starting here. Today's topic will be fast, easy, and fun. Give indexing a boost with zoning. We will be pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant. Kathryn started doing family history um, and somewhat to her surprise, she loved it. Her specialty is mentoring new family historians and helping them find success and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes that she's made. Kathryn teaches Sunday classes at the BYU Family History Library. She also presents at Riverton, Saturday seminars, and other family history events. Her column on family history ran in the Nauvoo Times for about a year and is still available online. Kathryn works for the LDS Church as a technical writer with a focus on usability and process improvement. Besides family history, she loves uplifting music, thought-provoking books, and spring lilacs. We'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Kathryn.
Great, thank you, Sean. So we'll just get the presentation loaded here. Okay, there we go. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm so glad that you could join us. And this is actually a really exciting topic, I think. It's a new pilot program that FamilySearch has started called zoning. And so today we're going to learn what zoning is and how you can get involved if you'd like to. So let's take a quick look at what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. First of all, of course, as you might expect, we'll talk about exactly what zoning is, and then we'll talk about how you can get access to participate in this pilot program. Then we will walk through zoning your first batch. We'll talk a little bit about some tips and tricks that take you beyond the basics. And then finally, of course, the thing that everybody loves to know is how to get help when you need it. So let's go ahead and dive in. What
Kathryn, if you
is,
want to go ahead and put the presentation in full screen mode.
I'm sorry, Sean?
It looks like it's still not in full screen, just to make it a little bigger.
Oh, let me see what I need to do there. Thank you for catching that. There, is that better?
Yeah, that works a little better.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so what exactly is zoning? Very simply put, it's using your mouse to draw boxes around articles on digital newspapers, any article that mentions a birth, a marriage, or a death. So as you can see from this example, births are purple, marriages are orange, and deaths are green. The zoned content is then given to indexers who make that content searchable. So ultimately, the content will be available in FamilySearch historical records, and you might even see it on somebody's person page as a record hint. So that's kind of the basics of zoning, just very quickly to explain what it is. If you're interested in more information, you can read the complete user's guide. It's available here at this URL. And don't worry if you can't get that written down all the way because we're going to cover this a little bit later as well. And then also these webinars are recorded, so you can come back and get the URL if you need to, or you're also welcome to email me. My email always appears at the end of the webinar. So that is just a basic description of what zoning is. So now let's talk about how you would get access to participate in this pilot program. Well, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that you've got the basic requirements and equipment that is needed for zoning. So you do have to have a device with an internet connection. Zoning cannot be done offline right now. It's also important to note that zoning works best with Chrome or Firefox. You can try it with a Microsoft browser, but from what I've heard, it does not work well. And so definitely you want to use Chrome or Firefox and not a Microsoft browser. And then you do need a mouse or a trackpad for both drawing the boxes and also for zooming. So a mouse with a scroll wheel tends to be the easiest. I don't have one, but I know on times when I've been on someone else's computer and used it, it really is easier. But if you don't have a mouse with a scroll wheel and you, for instance, have a trackpad, you can use two-finger dragging to scroll. And I'll actually give a little illustration of that later because more and more of us on laptops, we just have a trackpad and that's it. So it's good to know both ways to do it. So if you have those basic requirements, then this is how you can request access. You go to familysearch.org/ask/zoning. I'll give you a minute to write that down if you want to. Again, though, this will be available on the recording. Once you go to that screen, you'll be asked to sign in. So you just go ahead and sign in with your LDS account or your FamilySearch account. And then you're going to see a screen pop up, a little submission form. So you fill out this form, and the most important thing to note is that from the category drop down, you want to choose zoning so that they direct your request to the right place. And then the rest of it is just pretty straightforward. Fill out your name, your email. I don't think you have to give a phone number. The form will be submitted without that. And then just put what seems logical to you. You're requesting access for zoning. Please give me access. When you filled it all out, just go ahead and click Send Message. When you do that, within about 24 hours, you will receive an email that's similar to this one from FamilySearch. And it will give you welcome information and also give you the link that you need to click to get to the zoning website. When you go to the zoning website for the first time, of course, everything has to have legalese, right? So you're going to have terms and conditions that you agree to, and just read through those. And then when you get to the bottom, just go ahead and click, I think it's I agree or something like that. And then once you've done that, you will be taken to the zoning homepage where, very simple as you can see, you just click zone to get started. So now that you're to that point, you are ready to zone your first batch. So let's take a look at what you can expect when you're zoning your first batch. The zoning page, we might call it the zoning homepage or main page. I'm not sure. It probably doesn't really have a name. But this page where you actually do the zoning is divided into three parts. So the main part of the page, the biggest part, is the digital newspaper image. Then over here on the right-hand side, you've got thumbnail images for navigation. So as you're doing the zoning, you just click the image to move between the different pages as you need to. And then finally, we've got this toolbar up here at the top. And I'm not going to go through every one of these buttons right now, but we're going to be covering the most important ones as we proceed with the webinar. So, three simple steps to zone. The first step is to carefully read the content. Then, as you find content that qualifies to be zoned, we'll talk about that in a minute. When you find the content that qualifies to be zoned, you draw a zone about it. And then when you've drawn all your zones, you review it, do a careful review, and then when you're ready, you submit the batch. So that's a very quick overview of the three steps of zoning. Now let's look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. So the first step, carefully read the content. Sometimes when you open up that first window, the digital image is so small that you can't even read it. So zoning, in order to be able to zone, of course, you got to be able to read the content. So the first tip that I want to share is how to scroll. So the mouse scroll wheel, most of you who have a scroll wheel are probably familiar with that you just roll the scroll wheel one direction to make the image bigger and the other direction to make it smaller. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. But then also, as you zoom up, part of the image is probably going to be cut off over here on the side of the screen. So in other words, when it's really big, you're not going to see the whole image. So you're going to want to be able to drag that image. And you drag it the same way you do anything else like a Google map or other sites that you use. You just click, hold, and drag it to the position where you want it to be so that you can read what you need to read. Now, zooming on a trackpad is a little bit trickier, and if your trackpad's like mine, it's super sensitive. So that's why I say the scroll wheel on a mouse is easier if you have one, but still on a trackpad it's doable. And I like to use two fingers from like my index finger from each hand. I've seen pictures of people zooming on a trackpad where they use their index finger and their thumb. That doesn't work for me for some reason. So if it works for you, great, zoom that way. But if it doesn't, if you're finding you're having problems zooming on a trackpad, try the two-hand method with your index fingers on both hands. So as the illustration shows, if you want to make the image larger, just drag your two fingers outwards towards the edge of the trackpad. If you want to make it smaller, drag your fingers inwards towards the center of the trackpad. So what exactly do you zone? We saw in the beginning that we're looking for births, marriages, and deaths, but there's a little more to it than that. So you want to zone items that mention a name. So we do want the name of the person because otherwise how could anybody search for it when it gets into historical records, right? So the article has to mention a name and then also has to mention a birth, marriage, or death event type. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean by type? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, I wanted to mention a question that people often have, and that is, what if there's not an actual date of the event? The good news is that doesn't matter. So all you need to be looking for is the name and some type of qualifying event. But if it has an exact date, that's great. But if it doesn't, you don't need to worry because the newspaper date is automatically saved with every single zone, not just with the paper, it's the digital page itself, but with every single zone. So don't worry about the date, but do make sure that you've got a name and that you've got a qualifying birth, marriage, or death event type. So what do we mean by event types? Well, the obvious things, for instance, for a birth, is that a birth notice, somebody was born. That's an obvious one. But adoptions should also be zoned as births. A whole list of births, as you've probably seen in newspapers, get zoned as a birth. Birthday celebrations. For instance, John Jones celebrated his 21st birthday, something like that. That is also zoned because even though it's not at the time of his birth, it's 21 years later, it still provides genealogically valuable information. It still gives you the birth information. A name change is also considered something that you would want to zone as a birth. For marriage, as you might imagine, we do anniversaries, annulments, divorces, elopements, engagements, marriage licenses, and then, like for births, if it's a whole list, you still zone that, and we'll give some examples later. Marriage notice, anything that gives genealogically valuable information about somebody's marriage. Think of it in these terms. If you were searching on Family Search historical records and this was your relative in the article and it had this information, would you be glad to receive it? And if you would, if you feel that it would help you to, even if it's not specifically a marriage announcement or a birth announcement, if it has any of this genealogically valuable information in it, then we want to zone it. So same thing for deaths. If you see a death notice, a death list, estate information, even if it doesn't give the exact date of the death, that's okay. Oftentimes this will list relatives, which are very valuable and may give other information that would help you do genealogical research on that person. For military only, do lost at sea and missing in action, excuse me. Obituaries, that seems kind of obvious. You would want to zone that. Probates also. Now, here's an interesting one. Maybe you've seen it in older newspapers that people will post a newspaper thank you card to people who have helped. So they might say something like, the Redford family deeply appreciates the kindness shown upon the passing of our father last week, or something like that. So, if you see a thank you card that gives you information about a funeral or about a person who died, absolutely zone that too. That may be just the information that somebody needs for their research. Now, one thing that I've been learning is how important it is to watch for events in unexpected places. When I first zoned the image from which this is taken, I looked briefly at this and I said, oh, members of the Parker Lodge, 124 IOOF, they're directed to meet. Okay, I don't need to zone this. It's just a meeting of the Oddfellows. So that's what IOOF, International Organization of Oddfellows. So I thought, okay, I don't need to zone that. And I skipped it. And so fortunately, when I did my review, which we'll talk about later, I noticed that I had not zoned this and it should have been zoned because it is announcing the funeral of one of their members. So this, it gives the date of the funeral, the name of the person. So this is genealogically valuable information. So I needed to zone that. Same thing down here. I saw exempt fire company members are invited to a meeting. Well, fire, what are they going to talk about? Making fire safety or something. So I don't need to zone that, right? But on my review, I read that more carefully and saw this was also for a funeral. The date of the funeral is given, the name of the deceased person is given. So this is a genealogically valuable item, and so I want to zone it as a death. Here's another one that surprised me. From looking at this title, Carl Bremer is manager, you think, oh, that's just telling that somebody got a promotion or got a new appointment at a business or something. But the article mentions the death of his predecessor. So that is genealogically valuable information. So I zoned this whole article. And it's worth mentioning right here that and we'll cover this in a minute, you don't ever want to zone a piece of an article. If the article includes any genealogically valuable information, you zone the whole article. So even though this title doesn't refer to the person who died, it's still the whole thing gets zoned, and then the indexer will read this and they will realize that they'll look for the keyword death and they will realize that this article refers to the death of this Robert A. Marshall. Here's another surprise one. And I have to laugh. My friend Julianne mentioned that these old personals are kind of like ancient Facebook. So you'll see all kinds of interesting things like here we've got Dr. Hall has gone to Washington, Miss Gertrude Johnson has been visiting Mrs. Joseph Benson, and so forth. Um, just like the same kind of thing that you would see on Facebook today. But sometimes I'd be tempted to skip over the personals because it was all just so and so's visiting so and so arrived here, or blah, blah, blah. But as this example shows, you might see a genealogical gem. So here we've got a birth announcement in the personals, in addition to birth announcements being in the birth section of the newspaper. So this couple had a child, and even though it doesn't give the daughter's name, it still gives the parent's name. And bonus, it gives the mom's maiden name. I was just excited for this family. Whoever finds this after it's been zoned, I just was so excited for them that they'll know the mother's maiden name because often that's so difficult to determine. So you do want to read through the personals and zone anything that has to do with a qualifying event, a birth, marriage, or death. So you go as to actually drawing the zone, you go along and you read through, and as soon as you find a qualifying article or piece in the personals or whatever, you press B for birth, M for marriage, D for death, and that means on the keyboard actually. And that's a little confusing. People say press B, or I don't see a B anyplace on this screen. So it's actually to start the zone, you go ahead and click B, M, or D on your keyboard. When you do, your cursor changes to a crosshair, and that's what you use to draw. Now, the crosshair is really light, and so it might be a little bit hard to see. If you don't see the crosshair, just jiggle your mouse or move your finger rapidly on your trackpad, and that will probably enable you to see that crosshair. So then you just move the crosshair to the beginning of the content that you want to zone, and then just click, hold, and drag to draw the box. And as soon as you let go, that box will appear on the screen. And you see here, I've zoned a death item and another death item right here with a non-death item in the middle that didn't get zoned. But that's how I did that, is I just clicked D for death. It turned to a crosshair. I used my mouse to draw the box around the content, and then as soon as I let go, the box appeared. So remember, what you zone is exactly what the indexer is going to see. So you want to put yourself in the indexer's shoes as far as what to zone and how to draw the boxes. So let's take a look at some mistakes that you want to avoid. Here's an example of where I went through and I only zoned in this article the information that speaks specifically about the death. But look, if you were the person who was, this was your relative, would you want the whole article? Gosh, I sure would. He was a native of Liverpool, England. That's important to know. He was age 55, it looks like. He leaves behind three daughters and he's interred in Mountain View Cemetery. So all of that is valuable information. So you don't want to zone only the lines of an article that mention the event. You always want to zone the entire article. You never know when that context is going to be helping to somebody, helpful to somebody. Now here's another mistake to avoid. Notice that I have clipped off the edge of the words here. Could somebody maybe get most of the words? Well, maybe and maybe not. And so, again, put yourself in the place of the indexer. Would you want to get content to zone where the edges were cut off and you couldn't maybe be confident of what all the words were? No, you would want the whole article. So don't make the zone too small. And on the other hand, you also don't want to make the zone too big. So you see here, I have indexed, or excuse me, zoned part of the title of a completely different article. So that could possibly be confusing to the indexer. At the very least, it's distracting. To indicate to include text from a different article, that's probably making their job a little harder than it needs to be. So you don't want to make the box too big. And so, but the thing is, just to, in the interest of true confessions here, when I draw my boxes, they're almost never just right the first time. I pretty much always need to adjust them. And of course, you get better as you get along. And it's also easier to draw the boxes if you zoom in and make the image larger. And so what I'll do is I'll zoom in, I'll draw the box, I'll zoom in, and then I'll say, okay, does this need adjusting at all? If it does need adjusting, it's so easy to adjust. You just put your cursor over the edge of the zone box that you want to adjust. It turns into a double arrow, and then you just click and drag that arrow until the edge of the box is where you want it to be. So this is an example of a box that is just right. It's not too big, it's not too small, it includes the whole article, it doesn't cut anything off. It will be easy for the indexer and valuable for the person who reads this content once it's indexed. Final thing that sometimes I get questions about, you'll notice that sometimes yellow dots will appear, and people ask me, well, does that mean that the everything on the page has been zoned? But there's actually no way for the computer to tell if everything's been zoned right now. The human has to do that. So the dot actually appears here in the navigation bar when you have zoned at least one item. So when you zone your first item on a page, you notice the dot appears here, but it doesn't mean that there isn't more content to zone. Okay, I wanted to comment also that it's very, very important to do a careful review before you submit the batch. And I have found actually that it's helpful to pray as I'm doing my review to ask Heavenly Father, please to help me notice if I've missed anybody. And every single time I've gone back to do a review, I've found something I've missed. So that just says how important a review is. And there's not a formal button that you click to do a review. I just finish zoning all the content and then I just click the first thumbnail up here and then I just reread every page carefully, and especially with that prayer in my heart that I'll be able to find something if I've missed it, because you just never know. That one piece that I missed might have been exactly the piece that somebody else needs. So I for sure want to find all the content on the page. Okay, now that we've covered the basics of zoning your first batch, let's get into some kind of out of the basics things that you may encounter when you're zoning. So one thing, as we mentioned before, you may encounter lists. Now, normally, as you saw when we had that death announcement, we just drew one box around the one death announcement. Or where those death notices were separated by non-death information, I drew a box around each one. But the exception to that one box per event rule is a list. Because you can imagine it would be kind of a like not very helpful if an indexer just got one little piece off this list. For one thing, it doesn't have the title, and then for another thing, there's no context. And so if you get a list of just a bunch of one-liners that have to do, or one or two-liners that have to do with, death information, oops, sorry, clicked the screen accidentally and made it advance. So if it's a whole list of probates or a whole list of divorces, a whole list of births or whatever, you actually zone that as one event and you be sure to include the heading. And again, that makes sense. If you put yourself in the shoes of the indexer, would they want just one little piece of this with no context, or would they want the whole list to index? And they, at least for me, I would for sure want the whole list. So lists are always zoned as a whole and do include the heading. You can edit a zone, and this is different than resizing. Basically, the two features of editing are if you want to change the type. For instance, one time I accidentally zoned a birth as a death. So if you want to change the type, it's very easy to do that. You just hover over the box that you've zoned. You get this little pop-up, and on the pop-up there are two options. To change the type, you just click the pencil icon and you get a drop-down that lets you change the type. If you decide, oh gosh, I meant to zone something else and I want to get rid of this whole zone, this isn't right, then you can actually completely delete the zone. And you do that by clicking this circled X. Stitching. This is an interesting topic, and again, it has to do with making things easy for the indexer. So when articles appear or when they span multiple columns, when they appear over multiple columns, you need to do what's called stitching them. The trick about that, oops, excuse me, there we go. I thought I had a note there. I guess I will just say it verbally. The trick here is that you can't stitch articles that cross pages. So you can stitch articles that cover multiple columns on one page, but there's no way to stitch articles across multiple pages. So if you see, like you're on an image and you see an article that was continued from another page, you just zone that as its own zone. Well, how do you stitch an article? First of all, it consists in drawing zones on every piece of the article. So we first of all create a zone for the title. Next, we create a zone for the first column. Then we create a zone for the second. And if there are any additional, you would create zones for them. So you end up with this newspaper image that has these zones all for the same article, but they're all separate zones. Then you hold down the Control key on your keyboard and you click the zones in reading order. So I would first click the title, then I would click this column, then I would click this column, and when I do, I click Stitch Zones up here to actually join them as one article, and the article turns blue to show that it has been stitched. So if you have questions about that, we're going to take questions at the end of the webinar. So go ahead and put a question in the chat box and we will cover that when we get to the end. Oh, there's my note. I put it in a different place than I thought. So here's the tip that you can only stitch zones on a single page. If you see zones that are separated, or excuse me, articles that are separated across pages, you do just have to zone them as separate zones and they can't be stitched. Now, occasionally you may come across a digital page that looks like it has no content that needs to be zoned. When that happens, you just select that page and then you click No Content to Zone. But you want to be really careful there because the reason that this image even shows up in the zoning project at all is that FamilySearch did a keyword search on these digital images and discovered keywords that pertain to births, marriages, or deaths. And so this isn't just all the content from every page of the particular newspaper, it's only content that had certain keywords in it. Now, here's an example of why you might get a page that has a keyword but still has no zonable content. The other day, I saw this headline on an article and it said something like Jane Marie born. I don't remember the name, but it was just like Jane Marie born at such and such. And I thought, oh great, there we go. There's a birth thing to zone. Well, it turned out that it was like a baby lion at a zoo, and we don't zone baby lions. So I just had to laugh at that. But if that the reason that page got included as having zonable content was because it had something that mentioned a birth, but it wasn't the birth of a human. So as you if you think there's no content to zone, try and figure out what might have caused that image to be included. So if you see a birth of a baby lion or a penguin or whatever, then you know, okay, that's why it got included, but I've read this page really carefully and I do not see any qualifying birth, marriage, or death events. If that's the case, then you just go ahead and click no content to zone. And then when you do that, an X will appear on that digital image so that you know that you've marked that page as having no content to zone. And another thing that happens is the button changes to has content to zone. And that, of course, is useful if you're doing a review and you figure out that you missed something and it does have zonable content after all. So you click has content to zone and then go ahead and zone that content. Now, how long does a batch stay? Batches stay from in your queue or whatever for 5 days from the time that you first open it. And you'll notice if you exit out of zoning, you don't have to save it or anything. If you exit out of zoning and then come back in later, that batch will still be there up to 5 days. But if you get to the fifth day and think, oh my goodness, I've still got 2 more pages to read, and I know I'm not going to have time to do it, well, then there's this nifty feature that lets you hold a batch, and that will let you hold it for another 5 days. Well, if you don't want to, of course, hold it indefinitely because we want to move the zoning process through, but each time you click hold, you're going to get a 5 day extension. So don't abuse it, but do use it when you need it. If you're right in the middle and you think, oh my gosh, I don't have time right now, but I know that within the next 2 or 3 days I'm going to be able to get to this, then go ahead and click hold batch and it will be there when you come back. Finally, what do you do if you need help with your zoning questions? The training materials on the zoning site are wonderful. So you go to the zoning site, and I just noticed actually that I do not have the URL here. So I apologize for that. I'll post that on the YouTube channel in a comment to include the homepage of this particular page that I'm showing right here on the screen. So on this page, there's a box that says training resources. So you go ahead and I'll show you a larger detail of that. You can go ahead and click any of these items here to learn more about zoning. And if you use a Mac, you'll be particularly interested in this user tips sheet. So any of these are interesting to read and helpful, and I've been told that there will be more tips coming in the future, more resources coming in the future, so you want to watch for that. Another great way to get help for zoning is to go to the Help Center. And as you probably are aware, the way to get to that is to click Get Help at the top of pretty much any FamilySearch page. And then in the box, the search box, just search for zoning. And when you do that, you get taken to the Help Center and you see a list of articles that have to do with zoning. To read the article, you just go ahead and click on the name of the article and you'll get a lot of great information. Another thing that you can do is click the Help button on the zoning main screen. And what that does actually, do you remember that screen that we looked at that allowed you to request access to zoning? it gives you a screen similar to that. It's actually a help request form. So you click help, you get the help request form, and you fill it out and you send it and submit it, and it gets sent to the zoning support team specifically, and then they are able to help you with your zoning question. Another thing you can do is click Get Help on the top of any Family Search page and then click Contact Us. What that does is take you to a page that displays your local Temple and Family History consultants. The one iffy thing here is that not all consultants know about zoning. Your consultant may. So, for instance, in my stake, if somebody contacted me, we have resources to help people. But if someone hasn't heard about it or hasn't gotten involved yet, that because this hasn't been widely announced. Again, remember this is just a pilot program, so don't be surprised. And of course, the person that you're contacting shouldn't have to feel bad at all if they don't know about zoning. It would actually be a great opportunity for you to tell them about it. So if they don't know about zoning, just let them know and try one of the other help resources. So, in conclusion, zoning may seem like a very simple, well, it is. It's a very simple activity, and you might not immediately see the benefits of it, but just remember that the zoning that you do is helping people find their families. So that concludes our presentation for today, and thank you so much for attending. Sean, do we have any questions that we need to answer?
So no one typed any questions in yet. I'll give them one last chance. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and type them into the box on the right of the screen. But yeah, Kathryn, I'll just let you know if
That
we
sounds
have any later. Yeah.
terrific.
Um, all right. Well, thank you so much for the presentation, Kathryn. That was great to learn about those new features. Um, just one final reminder to anybody who's interested in joining us for our next webinar, which will be Tuesday. And that will be again about the program Fold 3. James Tanner will be giving that presentation Tuesday at 3 p.m. Um, and then feel free again to let us know if there's any subjects that you'd like to hear in the future. And if you have any questions for Kathryn, go ahead and type them into our questions pod here on the right of the screen, or like she said, you can email her or comment on the video that we post to YouTube. And thanks again to Kathryn.
Thank you.